as the economy shut down during the pandemic have not been fully resolved. And so in some areas, we do see some shortages, which have led to some higher prices. We have a few updates in terms of additional data since we did our preliminary forecast. So we have May employment and unemployment data for both the US and Washington. We have a new blue chip GDP forecast that we have incorporated into our US forecast, slightly higher from 6.6 to 6.7% growth for 2021 US GDP. And we do have a May inflation number. The CPI is up 5% in May over May 2020. So that's the new data that we've been able to incorporate. Forecast risks, as I said, COVID really is, again, both on the upside and the downside. It really depends on how quickly cases decline or whether those variants lead to any sorts of increases in hospitalization. So that's the up and down side of that. Another upside risk would be, Congress is discussing an infrastructure package. There is the potential for additional stimulus legislation. Those could have some positive impacts on economic activity. The other downside risk, as I mentioned earlier, is that recovery of the supply chain takes longer than expected, and that we have higher than expected inflation. So just a couple of things to sort of frame the forecast. This is looking at a leading economic index put together by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The members of OECD are most of the developed economies of the world. And what you can see is that whether we're talking about the US or the organization as a whole, which represents a big chunk of global GDP, we are up above the pandemic. This suggests that both for the US and globally, we are expecting continued economic expansion. And I just wanted to kind of go back and look at GDP forecasts for this year. For the last three forecasts we've done, so November of last year and then March and June of this year. And what you can see if we look at the US or if we look at Washington State's major trading partners, with the exception of Japan, what we've seen over those three forecasts is continued improvement in those forecasts of GDP. Now, one of the things that the pandemic did was to really alter patterns of consumption, and it shifted consumption at the household level away from services and towards consumer durables. Basically things that people could use at home to substitute for some of those services that they either couldn't enjoy because those businesses were closed or were concerned about social distancing and COVID. So if we look at and this is US data, but if we look at personal consumption expenditures relative to January of 2020, you can see a huge increase in motor vehicle purchases, in durable recreational goods. So that's going to be things like bicycles, exercise equipment, kayaks. The green line here, furniture, appliances, household durables. So all of those, we've seen a big increase. But if we look at everything else, and that's going to include those services such as entertainment and healthcare, as well as some of the other things noted over here on the sidebar, you see that they're barely back to pre-pandemic levels. So we've really seen this shift towards consumer durables, many of which are big ticket items, and away from services. Now, looking at national retail sales in May, we get maybe a hint that that pattern is starting to change. So this is going to look at retail sales and food service, so restaurant sales, no services other than food service. And what we see is a 1.3% decline in May. And over on the sidebar, we see some of those, household-oriented durables. We've seen some even bigger dips in building materials, in motor vehicles, in electronics and appliances. So this may give us a hint, it's one data point, but that we're starting to see consumers, as the economy reopens, shift back to a little bit more of a typical pattern that's going to weigh those services a bit more heavily and durable goods a little bit less. And I found this interesting. This is from a website called the Opportunity Insights Economic Tracker, and this is using some Google GPS data to look at where people spent time relative to January of 2020. So basically relative to before the pandemic. And you can see right away big dips in visiting retail stores and restaurants, going to work, and increases, a bit seasonal there as it dipped in the winter, but and big increases in parks. And as the sidebar notes, even as late as early June of this year, people are still spending, the time outside of the home is still 5% lower than it was before the pandemic. So people are spending more time at home. That's starting to change a little bit, but this is very consistent with the idea of purchasing more goods that you could use at home to substitute for some of those services that you either couldn't access or were uncomfortable accessing. If we look at small businesses, we're starting to see some improvement in small business optimism and in sales expectations. You can see here through May here that we're starting to see small businesses expect a pickup in sales. In terms of employment, we did have a dip in December, both here in Washington and nationally, but so far this year, we have added jobs every month, and that's good. But again, as the sidebar notes, not back to pre-pandemic employment levels. So just turning to the economic forecast, as I mentioned, higher GDP growth for the US this year and next compared to our March forecast. So that has the effect of raising the level of GDP all the way out through 2025. And again, sort of the same story here with Washington personal income, higher growth this year and next, and that will again have that effect of raising the level of personal income relative to March through our forecast period. A little bit stronger employment than we had forecast in March, but looking at an average growth rate of about 2.2% for Washington employment for this year through 2025. And then, as I mentioned, a stronger forecast for residential construction activity, especially this year. The first quarter, as the slide notes, a 42-year high, almost 43-year high in residential building permits in Washington State. Now, turning to revenue, our revenue at collections. So those are our major sources. So that's retail sales, business and occupations tax, public utility use tax, tobacco products. Those have increased for 4 straight months, and receipts for April activity were 8.4% above their March level. So very, very strong activity, economic activity, and very strong collections in the last several months. And as I mentioned, real estate transactions remain strong, down from that recent peak in December of last year, but still quite strong, and especially on the residential side. Cannabis collections, they're down from last year's big peak, but they continue to run a bit stronger than we had anticipated in March. So we have raised our forecast for cannabis collections, as you can see here. So we are increasing that forecast by 20 million for the rest of this biennium, 61 million for next biennium. So as I mentioned, we have increased the forecast for this biennium, $838 million. About 645 million of that is our current forecast variance. So most of that is actually in the door. And then for next biennium, 1,798 million increase. And let me show you where that breaks out. The majority of this is sales tax. So the sales tax collections have been, retail sales activity has been very, very strong. Certainly much stronger than we'd anticipated in March. And in March, we had certainly raised those levels. But this again speaks to that, shift in consumption patterns towards those, in some cases, higher ticket durable goods and construction activity. So a lot of this forecast increase is sales tax. This is just a summary of 2021 revenue legislation that is included in the revenue forecast numbers I have given you. And as always, of course, we have our alternative forecasts, so an optimistic, a pessimistic, and a forecast based on the average of the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors economic assumptions. The range here is pretty small around the baseline because there's not much of the biennium left. These are our alternative forecasts for next biennium. So that's a full biennium forecast. So of course, the ranges around the baseline there are a bit bigger, quite a bit bigger. And these give you the fiscal year growth rates, again, for all funds subject to the budget outlook process from this June forecast. So just to wrap up, both nationally and in Washington, economic activity has been stronger than we expected in March, especially retail sales. That's been the big driver, as you saw in that breakout of where the 2021-2023 biennium forecast changes came from, mostly retail sales. Again, COVID and inflation do pose forecast risks. And if we look at biennial growth rates, this forecast indicates that the current 2019-2021 biennium will have revenue 15.4% above 2017-2019, and then for next biennium 2021-2023, that will be 9.9% above the current biennium. So with that, I'd be happy to try to answer any questions.
Excellent. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Lurch. Are there any questions from council members? Senator Wilson.
Thank you. Again, I can't find my raise my hand button. Oh, there it is, reactions. Okay, I do have a question. We show that we have 8,900 more jobs in Washington this year, or since May, and our unemployment is 5.3%. Right, I'm looking at slide 3, I think.
Right.
Could you tell me? Can you tell us how many jobs are available, and what the unemployment 5.3% represents in unemployment numbers, rather than a percentage?
We do have job openings data nationally. We don't for Washington. My understanding is that the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics has been working on some kind of experimental state level job openings data, but I do not know if that's really available yet. So we can look into that. But right now, the only thing I'm really familiar with and aware of is at the national level. I cannot tell you off the top of my head what that 5.3% represents in terms of the number of unemployed people. We can definitely get that number to you, though.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lurch. Representative Orcutt.
Oh, excuse me, Senator Wilson. One of my colleagues has informed me that number represents about 205,000 people here in Washington that are unemployed.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the real-time update. Representative Orcutt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is very similar to Senator Wilson's question. You said we're not back to pre-pandemic levels of employment. Remind us what the number of unemployed was, or what the pre-pandemic employment was, and where we are relative to that in actual numbers.
Let's see. I'm going to have to go off the top of my head. I think we were looking at about 3.9 million people working in Washington in February of 2020. I will verify that and get back to you. So we're about 200,000 off of that right now.
So the 200,000 that are unemployed that refers to the number that are unemployed because of COVID, not total unemployed? Because we would have had some unemployed even during the even pre-pandemic, isn't that correct?
Yes, absolutely. We had definitely lower unemployment rates. The jobs data and the unemployment data do come from different sources. And so those numbers don't always perfectly line up, because the unemployment data is going to come from a survey of households, whereas the jobs data, the number of people employed, will come from a survey of employers. So sometimes you can get, a little bit of a mismatch there. So certainly there would have been some level of unemployment prior to the pandemic. So not all of those people necessarily, are unemployed due to COVID.
Thank you. Are there any other questions of council members? I have a question, Dr. Lurch. You mentioned one of the downside risks being inflation. What can you tell us about how that is currently being quantified and potentially forecast out into the future if that data is available? And is this similar to other times historically, economically, post World War II or other eras where there was robust public investment, and how that translated into inflation?
So there's a couple of pieces to the higher inflation, and so first of all, if we look at, say, those May inflation numbers of 5%, so that's comparing the price level in May of this year to May of 2020. If we go back and look at kind of March and April and May of 2020, because the economy was largely shut down, non-essential businesses were closed or had lower capacity, what we see is very weak prices. And so to some extent, that comparison, economists and statisticians will refer to that as a base effect, if you will. But because prices were so low artificially during the pandemic, because the economy wasn't functioning normally, that's one reason that does make current prices look higher. The other thing, a couple of other things, one of which you alluded to, is certainly after both world wars, as the economy switched from producing war material to going back to consumer products, you saw this burst in demand for consumer goods, but in some cases those supply chains weren't fully up and running. And we have some of those issues now. So we've gotten the stimulus checks that have helped with people who've lost their jobs, have allowed people to go out and make purchases. But we have industries that have closed down during the pandemic, started to get back up and running, but that has caused some shortages and some higher prices. A great example is to look at lumber. We know that lumber prices per 1,000 board feet were as high as $1,700. And now I believe, I haven't looked at spot prices real recently, but I think we're down around $900. And what basically happened is those mills essentially shut down. It took them a while to get back and running, to get their employees back. And because of those high prices, that has encouraged, of course, people who own mills to run them at absolutely full capacity. And so now we're starting to see those supply chains in some areas unkink. That should help to bring down prices. The Federal Reserve Chair was in front of Congress, I believe, yesterday. And his view is that these price increases are transitory, that as these supply chain issues get worked out, we'll see inflation kind of come back to what the Fed is looking at, roughly around 2% as their target. But there is the risk that, of course, that doesn't happen. Our forecast is basically in line with the views of the Fed.
Thank you very much for that explanation in lay terms, Dr. Lurch. Representative Orcutt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Lurch, on slide 8, you note that motor vehicle and parts sales are down 3.7%. I'm wondering if part of that is due to the chip shortage, and what you think the duration of that's going to be, or do you think that we've had a bubble in motor vehicle sales that's now going to, that's beginning to burst on us?
I think it's going to be a combination of those. We know that chip shortages have had, have put a definite kink in auto production. And we know that prices for used cars, as people maybe have found that they couldn't get those new cars, or new car prices were going up, they went to look for used cars. So we've certainly seen prices go up in both those areas. But as prices go up, that's going to cause some people to sort of, reconsider. It's not clear how quickly that chip shortage is going to turn around. That may be one of the areas where that supply chain takes longer to adapt. That is something that we may see not work out as quickly as some other areas. So I'm guessing that part of that decline is a combination of those two, of high prices and consumers reacting to that, but also to a lack of supply.
Thank you, Dr. Lurch. Senator Rolfos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Lurch, about a year and a half ago, maybe even over the last 2 years, we always had a slide that noted exports and aerospace as potential risks. Can you talk a little bit about that? Where's your staff in terms of analyzing Boeing sales, and does that just not feed into our economic outlook right now?
No, it certainly does. Washington is a very export dependent state. Exports have continued to be weak, but we're starting to see some improvement. And based on press reports, Boeing has sold off most of the 737 MAXs that they had parked, that had been sold and then canceled. Contracts got canceled, or they weren't able to fly. So as air travel starts to improve, that picture is starting to look better. So that's certainly positive. If we look at the ag export data, you'll see some big jumps, but if we dig into that a little bit, a lot of those increases are for agricultural products that get transshipped through Washington. That does generate jobs for transportation and at the ports, but you'll see some big increases in soybean and corn exports, which are largely not, coming from Washington state. So I think certainly on the aerospace side, as we look at air travel picking up, that's certainly a positive for that.
Thank you, Dr. Lurch. Are there any additional questions? I'm not seeing any other questions from council members. Chair will entertain a motion to adopt the revenue forecast as presented.
Moved.
It's been moved and seconded to adopt the revenue forecast as presented by Dr. Lurch. Discussion on the motion? Seeing none, will all members wishing to adopt the forecast, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The forecast is adopted. Thank you very much, Dr. Lurch and council members. We will now go to questions. And as Ms. Dallenbach said at the beginning, if you would please contact her via the chat mechanism, Ms. Dallenbach will moderate the Q&A portion, and now that we have an adopted forecast.
Mr. Chair, we only have one question, and that is from Rachel LaCourte from the Associated Press.
Excellent, thank you. Ms. LaCourte, please proceed.
I don't see Rachel as a little box on here.
Apologies, I forgot to unmute. You think I know this by now. So I just wanted to get comments from some members of the council on how you're looking ahead to next year. I know we're several months from the next session, but this is a pretty significant jump from March and certainly a turnaround from where we were last June. So as you're thinking about budgeting in the future, what is your takeaway from these most recent numbers?
Does anyone want to volunteer to begin the
I'll start out. I think it's time to start looking at some tax relief.
Thank you, Representative Orcutt. Any other folks? Senator Wilson?
Sure. I guess I would say the same thing as Representative Orcutt. I think in light of this good news, this seems to be to open up a door of opportunity for us to give back to the taxpayers of Washington and consider a tax rebate. Right now, we've got California and Idaho and Oregon all returning money back to their taxpayers. So with the great outlook that we have here today, I don't think we need to be looking at any more tax increases for sure, and maybe looking at giving back.
Thank you, Senator Wilson. Senator Rolfus?
Yeah, I'll just add, we have a very big commitment to returning taxes in the form of sales taxes in the form of rebates through the Working Families Tax Credit that we all adopted. And I think this puts us on track to not, I think we have the financial capabilities. I think we can feel confident that we'll be able to put that program into play and maybe even increase some of the rebates that we had all agreed to. But I also want to just always offer caution. We'll get new numbers in the fall, and those will be the numbers the governor leads with, and those will be the numbers that we start working with. So certainly this is good news, but I wouldn't start writing a budget based on these numbers today.
Thank you, Senator Rolfus. Are there any other comments? I would just offer and reiterate, as Senator Rolfus did, these are very good numbers. This is very good news. And to the point of your question, referencing back 1 year ago this week, where we were over $9 billion projected shortfall. So we've been on a wild ride over the course of the last 12 months. And it gives me pause and caution as we approach with the reminder, as I was told as a child by my folks, history did not begin this morning, and the world is not going to end next week. So we need to take these numbers, take them for what they are, knowing that it is a snapshot, and we have been through a wild ride while improving in recent months. I think a note of caution as we go forward for expenditures, whether they be tax expenditures or program expenditures, we should do it eyes wide open with an eye towards sustainability. Ms. Dallenbach, are there any other inquiries or any other comments by council members?
There were no other questions.
Okay, Senator Wilson.
Sorry, I just wanted to say, you know, we're also looking at it in 7 days from now, we will be fully open. So I think that that is something else that is other good news that we can add on to today that should help with a future outlook.
Thank you, Senator. Seeing no other comments or questions, we will adjourn the Economic and Revenue Forecast Council meeting. Thank you all for your attendance and attention. We are adjourned.